We're going to get started, and I'll turn your sound off at the same time, okay?
Yep.
Hi, I'm John White with Frederick & Company, sponsors of the World of Private Offerings. Today, over 300 million people in the world suffer from peripheral neuropathy. Over 40 million in the United States alone. Our guest today is Phil Walter, CEO of BioList Incorporated in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His company has developed a breakthrough technology based upon artificial intelligence and machine learning that relieve the symptoms of this disease and have successfully treated over thousands of patients. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Phil Walter.
Thank you, John, for that introduction, and thank you, everybody, for participating in this seminar. I hope to be informative about peripheral neuropathy and give you some useful information. I also hope to intrigue a couple of you into looking closer at BioList as an intriguing and very unusual investment opportunity, very attractive one at that. BioList is the name of the company, and Relief Therapy is the name of the therapy that we have developed and licensed to practitioners around the country. So let me start at the beginning and talk about what peripheral neuropathy is. It afflicts about 40 million patients in the US and about 300 million worldwide. This is a disease of the peripheral nervous system. It's very common, very prevalent. It is a chronic disease in that it has no cure, and there is no disease-modifying therapy available. It is progressive in that the symptoms just keep getting worse over time. And it's often debilitating because these symptoms, this progression leads to the severity of symptoms that debilitate patients and make them unable to live a normal life. It is triggered by diabetes. About 70% of diabetics will get neuropathy. The majority of chemotherapy patients will get neuropathy, as well as dialysis patients. There are also many prescription drugs that will trigger it. Statin drugs, for instance, or some antibiotic drugs like Levaquin and Cipro. Those will trigger it. There's about 100 things or more that will trigger peripheral neuropathy. The symptoms can be confusing because they depend on which nerves are involved and to what degree. Pain is very often associated and thought of in terms of neuropathy, but that really afflicts only about 20% of the neuropathy patients. Numbness is by far the more common symptom and can be the most debilitating symptom. Now, numbness sounds rather innocuous, but in fact, numbness means also a loss of proprioception ability, and that's your brain's way of knowing where your foot is when you're not looking at it, for instance. So that allows you to walk or get on an escalator or jump without looking at your feet, without knowing, precisely having to look at them visually to see where they are. It also means that you can walk down a hallway without bouncing into the walls, and you can turn around without falling down, etc. That's proprioception. Along with loss of proprioception comes loss of protective sensation, and that can be even more serious in one particular case. If you are otherwise normally healthy, you have neuropathy, but otherwise you're in good shape, and you have shoes that don't fit right and they cause a blister, or you step on a piece of glass and you get a cut. If you're otherwise healthy, that's going to heal itself even if you're not aware of it, if you've lost the feeling in your foot. But if you're a diabetic, that may not be the case. For a diabetic, an injury to the foot that is numb can be very serious because they don't know the injury's there, and the diabetes will, in many cases, keep it from healing. So that injury becomes ulcerated. That injury, the only thing ultimately that can be done with that injury is amputations. And I'm going to talk more about this and how severe this is to that patient. But other symptoms of neuropathy include burning, tingling, hot-cold sensitivity, etc. So again, it depends on which nerves are involved and to what degree. What's available to fix it? Nothing can cure it. The standard of care, which is those things that are approved by the FDA for this condition, consists of repurposed drugs, and the two that are approved are Cymbalta and Lyrica, although Neurontin is also used off-label as our opioid drugs for the pain. But these drugs, therapies, only address pain, and they don't do a terribly great job of it because the majority of patients that take these drugs do not get any benefit, don't get a reduction of pain. Those that do get a reduction of pain get about a 30-34%, just a little bit above placebo rate. About a third of the patients that take the drug, whether they get a benefit or not, report adverse side effects. And these drugs have no effect whatever on any other symptoms other than pain. So if pain's not your primary symptom, these drugs are not going to do anything for you. There are alternative modalities on the marketplace. There's a lot of advertising for lots of things to help with neuropathy. These include TENS units or LED arrays or class 3 cold lasers, those are called sometimes, acupuncture, hypnosis, nutrients, etc. All those things are marketed out there as solutions for neuropathy. The problem is they don't show any evidence, real clinical evidence through randomized clinical trials that they do anything, and certainly anything durable. So there's a problem. So what is relief therapy? That's the name of our therapy. Relief therapy is an approved therapy that employs, this is a long-winded definition, but bear with it, that employs a titrated treatment protocol to drive a class 4 therapeutic laser to stimulate biochemical processes, the outcomes of which are pain reduction, reduction of edema or swelling, increased blood flow, and accelerated healing. Those outcomes are well documented in the medical literature. They've been known and validated for a long time. However, applying this phototherapy to nerves is a whole nother kettle of fish. It's not so simple, and I'm going to describe how you go about doing that properly. But the therapy itself is non-invasive. There are no drugs involved, and there are no adverse side effects. There are some fine print you got to be aware of in that definition. There are three essential facts to understand. First of all, a therapeutic laser is not a surgical laser. The laser we use will not harm any tissue. We don't collimate the beam sufficiently to create enough heat to damage tissue. No harm done. The second thing to remember is that phototherapy is biphasic. What that means is if you apply too little, you get no result. If you apply too much, you get no result. You have to be in that Goldilocks zone, what is called in medicine the therapeutic window. If you're not there, you don't get a consistent result. You may by dumb luck, but you don't get a consistent, repeatable result. Therefore, the essential determinant of efficacy is not the laser. There are lots of people out there with lasers, class 4 lasers, claiming to treat peripheral neuropathy. If you don't have a titration method to go with it, and therefore the protocols that derive from that titration method, it's not going to help. It may help by random chance, but it's not going to be consistent. It's not going to be repeatable. Because phototherapy is biphasic, titration, that's the process of getting the fine-tuning of all the variables that go into that laser, is necessary to be able to get each parameter of the light and delivery just right to hit the therapeutic window, that Goldilocks zone, and achieve the desired outcome. Each patient is different, and each treatment for each patient is going to be different. And that's the hard part, because it has to be done over and over again each time the patient comes in. So let me describe what it takes to titrate a class 4 therapeutic laser for peripheral neuropathy. First, you have to gather big data. What I mean by that is you have to have a database for algorithms to look at and work with that is massive. To do that, we created a clinical software that we put in all our clinics, and those have been collecting data, all of our clinics, for many, many years. We have the largest patient registry in the world for peripheral neuropathy, and I'll describe that in a minute here. But that collects data through a discipline of managing and guiding an exam in which the practitioner has to collect certain information, put it in the system. That goes into a patient registry. That data, and that consists of signs, those are things that are measurable without the patient input. Symptoms, those are things that the patient reports, and the rate of change of those over time, because each time the patient comes in, they're different. Those values for those signs, symptoms, and rate of change are assigned to each of 36 area zones on the body. We deal with arms, legs, hands, and feet. So for instance, the bottom of the feet is six zones. Each zone, each of the 36 zones has a profile of these signs, symptoms, and rate of change built up. And again, that changes over time. That's how the data is all organized. That paints a picture of the patient, and then the artificial intelligence algorithms that we have designed use that profile of the patient, that picture, and compare it to all other patients that we've treated, and find those values of the parameters of the laser application that were the most effective and most important for the outcomes that are desired. And then it uses that information to construct the protocol for this patient right in front of it. Right? So every treatment is going to be different. Every patient is going to be different. The protocol that results from this is the actual parameter values of exposure applied to any treatment. So they include power density, that's how many photon packets of light are in an increment of the light, exposure time for every zone, every surface area zone, the surface area itself, what is it, and in what order are they treated? Remember, there's many of them. The wavelength of the laser beam and the pulse structure of the laser beam. Those are all important variables. They all make a difference to the outcome, and they all have to be just right. The laser itself is slaved to the cloud-based software. In other words, the therapist giving the therapy is not the one that sets up the computer. It's the artificial intelligence algorithms that determine what the variables should be, and the software then sends down to the laser over the cloud the proper instructions for how to set itself up to get the right result. The therapist then just has to paint by the numbers. Pretty simple process. Our relief therapy consists of 2 phases. The phase 1 is the most intense. That's the patient comes in day 1 with lots of symptoms. Maybe they're in a wheelchair, they're using canes, whatever. They come in, they're going to go through a cycle of about 14 treatments. That's the average, sometimes more, sometimes less. Average of 14 treatments, about every other day. Sometimes it's compressed a little bit, but about every other day. So that's about a 5-week regimen. At the end of that 5 weeks, those symptoms, all of them, should be down to, and normally are down to, about the subclinical level where the patient is no longer aware of them. So in other words, if the patient is debilitated, maybe they're in a wheelchair day 1, normally at the end of the initial course of care, their symptoms are behind them. They don't register any more symptoms, right? They're not in their wheelchair anymore. They can function normally. At that point, we have not cured the disease. And this is a progressive disease. It's going to keep trying to come back. So those symptoms are going to try and get worse over time. So we have the second phase, which is the maintenance care phase, in which a patient comes in 2 to 4 times a year to the clinic and gets an additional treatment. And that will keep the symptoms down to that at or near that subclinical level. I'm going to show you some data on that as we go. But let me talk about first that registry data, where all this is. We have the largest patient registry in the world for peripheral neuropathy. We've been collecting out of our centers since 2011. We have over 2,100 patients in that data set, 40,000 treatments, and over 6,000 data points per patient. So an awful lot of data. Just to give you a frame of reference, our data set is larger by twice what the next largest data set is for peripheral neuropathy patients, and it's more granular, more detailed, by 240 times that next largest registry. So ours is the only registry structured in a way to be used for titration, the only one. That registry shows us significantly positive outcomes right across the board, and this has all been validated by the Mayo Clinic's Biomedical Statistics Group. It shows significantly better results than standard of care, the drug therapies. It also correlates very nicely to a randomized clinical trial that was done at the University of Minnesota. I'll get into that in a minute. And interestingly, it doesn't matter where the neuropathy came from, what triggered it, it responds pretty much equally to across all the etiology. So whether you have diabetes-induced or chemotherapy-induced neuropathies, they will react the same way to this therapy. And it's now considered predictive of future outcomes, which makes it very useful for us for doing future clinical trials because we know the results before we even start. The first, I want to talk about another way to validate our system. Since we have so much data, there is a measurement tool called the Neuropathy Total Symptom Score, NTSS-6, that is used in the medical circles to assess and measure the intensity or the damage being done by peripheral neuropathy, the level of impairment, if you will. This is a well-published, well-validated, and accepted measurement of neuropathy. It's been used in many clinical trials, including the FDA's trials, et cetera. Any score on this measurement is considered, above 6, is considered to be an impairment. Any therapy that reduces this score by 1 point is considered to be significant by the FDA. Now, this measurement is no longer used simply because no one's ever been able to move it. It is a good measurement tool. No one's been able to affect it. When we apply this measurement tool, and we collect exactly the same data, to our registry data, pre to post therapy, we see that we can move that and reduce that score by almost 5.5 points. Very significant, very provocative validation of our data. The second validation has to do, that I want to talk about, has to do with diabetic foot ulcers, and I'll digress a minute and tell you why that's important. About 20% of diabetics are going to get a diabetic foot ulcer, statistically speaking. About 17% of diabetic foot ulcer patients undergo amputation within 12 months. This is the leading cause of non-traumatic lower extremity amputations in the United States. Over 15% of these patients are going to die within 12 months. And only half the patients with diabetic foot ulcers will survive 5 years from diagnosis. This is a dramatically serious problem. Diabetic foot ulcers correlate very highly to numbness caused by peripheral neuropathy. This is why numbness is so important as a symptom. So the second external validation I want to talk about then has to do with diabetic foot ulcers. There is a scoring mechanism called the Neuropathy Disability Score. It's used by endocrinologists. It's a test given to their diabetic patients. It is considered to be very accurate for predicting the risk of diabetic foot ulcers. The higher the NDS score, the higher the risk, etc. When we take this scoring mechanism and we apply it against our registry, because we collect the same data, we show a 59% reduction in the NDS score pre to post therapy. This is a very provocative point of data, suggesting that we might have a very significant impact with our therapy on the incidence of diabetic foot ulcers. The third validation, external validation, is the gold standard. This is a randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blinded clinical trial. The University of Minnesota Medical Center Oncology Department conducted such a trial. It was a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial. The results were peer-reviewed and published in a medical journal in January of 2017. Once they collected and enrolled all the patients into this trial, they were randomly sorted into one of two groups. And in phase 1 of the trial, the one group was treated with relief therapy, and the other group was not treated. They were given sham treatment. In other words, they thought they were getting treatment, but they weren't. So everybody was blinded. They didn't know whether they were getting it or not. And then the measurements were taken throughout the course of the trial, and then 16 weeks later to determine how it stuck. At the 16-week point, then the group that got the sham treatment, they were crossed over. They were given the real treatment to see what happens to their set of symptoms. So this is the actual data that was published, or this is the graph in that published data. The two vertical shaded areas are the phase 1 and the phase 2. In the phase 1, there was a sham group that got no treatment, and of course, over 16 weeks, their symptoms got worse measurably. That's to be expected. It's a progressive disease. The group that got the real treatment, however, their symptoms universally, and this is a composite score of all symptoms, dropped down to subclinical levels. The patient was no longer aware of symptoms. And then they started climbing back up at the 16-week mark, right? Then at the 16-week, the sham group was given the real treatment. Their symptoms likewise dropped, just like the first group, and then started to come back at the 16-week point. So the conclusion I can draw from this is the therapy really does work. It drops all symptoms very quickly down to subclinical levels. The question I have is what happens over time? Do those things just come back? Because this is a progressive disease. This graph answers that question. I said earlier, we have two phases. We have an initial care phase, and that's the line over here on the far left-hand side, precipitous drop in symptoms all the way down to the end of the initial course of care. That's time 0 for the maintenance phase. And then we have a maintenance phase, and as long as a patient comes in 1 or 2 times a year, sometimes it's more, sometimes less, they will maintain those symptoms down at that level. This graph shows data for 36 months, 3 years, and every single month in this data includes over 100 patients that are getting a maintenance treatment that month. So that's very dense data with a lot of patients in it, but you can see we keep them down at those levels. Very impressive results. This is a numeric comparison between Lyrica and Cymbalta, the 2 approved drugs, versus the outcomes of the trial at the University of Minnesota. Since the drugs are chasing pain and pain only, the non-responder rate for pain, that's people that didn't get any benefit, was pretty significant for Lyrica and Cymbalta, 50 and 67%. 0% for relief therapy. In other words, 100% of the patients that had pain got relief of pain with our therapy. How much relief? Well, Lyrica and Cymbalta got just a little bit above placebo rate. Our patients got 94% reduction in the pain symptom. Placebo rate, again, for the drugs is 30%. It was 3% for relief in this trial. Mean mitigation of numbness, tingling, and sensitivity, no results at all for the drugs. They didn't affect those symptoms at all. We got very significant reductions of those symptoms without any adverse side effects. And of course, the drugs had about a third of the patients getting adverse side effects. So let me just kind of summarize the business and the expansion plans. There is no other disease modifying therapy available, and symptomatic therapies are only marginally effective. BioList is the first to market with a disease-modifying therapy. It is a safe, significantly more effective, non-invasive, non-drug therapy. And there are significant barriers to entry for any competition. The biggest significant barrier is not just our patent application, it is the titration method and the data that you have to have in order to even think about doing titration. No one else has got that. We've got over an 8-year lead collecting that kind of data, and no one is chasing us. We are currently raising investment money to expand the company-owned clinics to all major markets. Now, those are going to be patient pay centers initially. We have investment opportunities for both large and small investors, and the investment funds are going to support clinic expansion and the process by which we get Medicare and insurance approvals down the road. Those are possible in the range. We start to get regional approvals in the range of 5 years. That really sets the tone for the big payoff for investors. So that's the presentation. I hope I've answered any questions you might anticipate, but just in case, I'm going to turn it back over to John and we'll do a Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Phil. And just to let everybody know, that was a lot of information, as you can tell. And everybody who has attended the call or registered will be receiving a copy of Phil's presentation. And so a number of questions did come in here. And one of them, here's one I think is pretty interesting, is that somebody wrote and asked how much is spent every year in the United States to treat peripheral neuropathy.
And the number is about $300 billion, and it's about 1.5 trillion worldwide. And the thing to keep in mind is that 300 billion is not just to actually affect the change in peripheral neuropathy, because there is no cure and there is no effective modifying therapy. That money is spent chasing the diagnostics and trying to determine, some of it anyway, a good share of it is trying to determine what caused the neuropathy. The assumption underlying that is that if you can get to the underlying trigger of neuropathy, you can affect the change in neuropathy. And that's really not a good assumption, because very early in the onset of neuropathy, it becomes a chronic disease. In other words, it's independent of what triggered it, and it's its own disease from that point on, and there's no cure for it. So some of that money, that $300 billion, is spent on modalities, as I mentioned in there, that chase a symptom. The drug therapy is a good example. They don't have any effect on the underlying problem, the nerve damage. They don't mitigate the nerve damage, and they only address a symptom, which is pain. And that's primarily what is chased. So the $300 billion is a large number, but it's really not a very effective expenditure because it's not dealing with the underlying disease itself.
Is that primarily all drugs, you think, a large percentage of it?
Well, a very large percent of it is with drugs, and again, those are just chasing pain, and they're not very effective at doing that. But yeah, drugs are a big part of it. TENS units, whether it's implantable or external, there's a lot of over-the-counter. A lot of things are positioned in the marketing materials to try and go after neuropathy, but not very successfully in terms of the real outcomes.
Yeah, well, based upon that, I had a question come in here about how does the company, what has the company done in the past, and what do they plan to do in the future to do marketing? And also, that same person asked how much up to date does it cost to acquire a new patient?
The marketing we've done, we ran, as a company, we ran almost 6 years of testing to see what kind of clinic works best. During that period of time, we did virtually all the marketing, or at least the lion's share of the marketing. we only marketed in markets where we had a clinic. There's no sense in marketing in Philadelphia if we don't have a clinic in Philadelphia. So that was all localized marketing, and we used every media there is. We learned a lot, etc. We have since turned over all the marketing to the local clinics. Now, as we go forward, we're out for funding now, but as we go forward with new funding, we're going to be opening company-owned clinics in lots of different markets and expand very rapidly. Then we'll be doing marketing, all media, in the markets where we open clinics. We'll probably, at least until we're represented in all 50 states, we're probably not going to do national marketing. It'll all be regional or local marketing based on where we have clinics. But it costs us anywhere from $90 to $150 to acquire a patient. That's a mixed bag of all the different medias. Each media has its own matrix, and different markets have different matrix. In other words, they react differently. So in one market, radio works best. In another market, TV might work best. In another market, PPC or internet might work best, etc. So there's a lot of differences by market, and then time of year, it matters. If you're in Florida, of course, you've got winter population there that's different than the summer population. So it's all over the map, and it's all localized. We do track that very intensively. Our clinical software has one of the third module of our clinical software is a module specifically designed to track the effectiveness and efficiency of media and to follow up with patients, etc., to make sure that we have the best opportunity of getting them into care and keeping them in care.
What again associated with that particular question? How much is what's the cost of the treatment, and how many treatments does a patient get on an average?
The typical patient, on average, goes through 2 courses of care. The initial course of care is on average 14 treatments. Sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 20, but on average it's 14 treatments for the initial course of care. That initial course of care is designed to take them from wherever they were at the maximum symptomology that they had down to the level where all their symptoms are at or near the subclinical level, where they're not aware of them, or at least they're not impeded by them in their lifestyle. So that's the objective of the initial course of care. At that point, we have not cured the disease. No one cures this disease. At that point, the disease will try and come back because it is progressive. So we put a patient on a maintenance phase at that point, and again, it depends on the patients themselves how long they can go in intervals. But the average is around 2 to 4 times a year. A patient will come in for one more treatment, and that will keep all their symptoms. I'm just talking about pain, I'm talking all symptoms, down at or near the subclinical level. Now, the initial course of care, because we're not insurance covered at this point, and we are working toward that, but we don't have it yet. The initial course of care, as a patient pay, and again, it depends on which clinic you go to, because we're independently owned, runs typically around $3,000 to $3,500 for initial course of care. And then the maintenance, again, it depends on which clinic you go into, but it's going to be in the $200 a visit range for the subsequent maintenance care treatments with individual patients.
And I think that leads to another question, is that you mentioned in the presentation insurance, or approval by the insurance companies where people can be reimbursed, and when would you anticipate that to happen?
Yeah, I'll just talk Medicare because the private insurance typically follows Medicare. Medicare has a well-defined process you have to go through to be able to apply for reimbursement, or at least have any hope of getting it if you apply. If you apply without their designated protocols in place, then you're not going to get it anyway. So where it starts is with the clinical trials. And we've got 2 of the 6 components done necessary to put in front of the board. Well, actually, we have a third, which is independent of the trials, which is the key opinion leader. So you have to. I can't go in front of the boards because I'm not an MD and I'm not going to listen to them. But when we have the top neuroendocrinologists in the country behind our protocol, believing in it and willing to go in front of the board and say, this is what we need, and we do have that. And we have one of the top oncologists in the country who goes in front of the board and says, if we need this, and we have that, that's important. So what they bring to the board when we put the package together is a set of 5 clinical trials. 3 have to be in the U.S., 2 of them have to be multi-site. So there's all kinds of requirements. We've done one of those. We have 4 to go. We've also got a registry, which is the 6th piece of data, which is very important considering that one of the top biomedical statisticians in the world is the one that evaluated our registry data and determined that it was predictive of future outcomes. In other words, it's the integrity of our data set is very high. We collect the right data, we collect the right way, and all the data we have is statistically significant. So we have density that's required. So all those pieces lead up to a path to get Medicare approval. You start down that path with regional approvals, not with national approvals. So you apply to one of the basically 8, there's some other issues, but basically 8 regions for Medicare, and you apply to them for a provisional status, or coverage status, which gives you about a year, and they will look at their data then and see if you're saving money and if your treatment's effective, etc. We anticipate, we have a full schedule lined out for these trials, and once we have our funding, we anticipate in starting before the end of year 4 to be going in front of the regional Medicare boards and asking for and getting provisional status for reimbursement. So that's year 4 out from funding. Once you have a few of those regionals and they've had a year to look at their data, etc., then you have a good chance of going to the national board and getting national determinations, which then you got everything. As you get the regions, of course, in those regions, patients would then have to only pay a copay. And private insurance companies typically follow whatever Medicare is doing. There is a way to help speed up that process and enhance it, which is if you can get the large HMOs, and there are many of them around the country, if you can get them on board, because they're self-funded, basically, self-funded insurance companies. If you get them on board, then they will influence the Medicare board decisions, the regional decisions, etc. So those are all tracks that we're working, and you have to have data. We need to get through the biomarker trials, the 2 trials that are ready to go and set up as soon as we have funding. They're off and running. If we finish the 2 biomarker trials, that'll take a year to a year and a half to get those published, and then we'll be off to the private insurance groups in the Medicare region. So it's a process that I would expect we'll start getting the regionals in year 4, maybe even a little bit earlier than that, but I would expect year 4 certainly to be getting the first of the regions.
Well, how many centers today?
We have 7 centers today. They're all independently owned. Again, as I said, going forward, this is 7 centers we've been conducting a test of what type of center works best, what grows the best, what has the best outcomes, etc. And for a company which is the most profitable. Going forward, once we have our funding, we're going to be pushing and opening company-owned centers as opposed to independent centers. Not that we won't still have independents, we will. But we will also be opening company-owned centers, and that'll be our emphasis for our growth going forward is company-owned centers, because they tend to grow faster and bigger because they have focus. These company-owned centers are going to do nothing but neuropathy. They don't do any other medical treatments there, which all the independents do. They only will do really neuropathy therapy. So those will grow faster. They are more profitable, etc. So that's where we're going.
So what? Another question came in about the investment opportunity, and you mentioned that the question came in as it said that you referred to the fact that you have investment opportunity for both large and small investors. They wanted you to explain that a little more.
Yeah, for the large investor, and we're out for a $20 million round in Series B, and that's the big investors that write big checks. But I've gotten a lot of interest from small investors who they don't write 7-figure checks, they want a smaller investment. Hence, these are angel investors. And so we have, right now, in fact, this week, launched what's called a SAFE. SAFE stands for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. This is an instrument that came in with the Jobs Act, and it is designed to stimulate investment by small investors in startup companies. The SAFE works much like a convertible note does. What happens is you put in $1, not more than $1, but you put in $1. And what happens is when the B round, when the big investor comes in, that dollar turns into the same stock that the B round is buying with a discount. It actually gets a 20% discount. So that's an incentive to get in early. It's essentially a bridge to the B. So it's an incentive to come in early under a safe that will convert to the B preferred corporate stock when the B comes in. And it carries a discount when it does. So you actually get 20% more for your same investment cost. So that's the one that's designed for the smaller investors.
Okay. There's another question that came in here. Oh, there was one that's interesting. Basically, they want to know about the laser. Okay. In terms of, did you design your own laser, or do you have a custom? Do you use off-the-shelf lasers?
We use an off-the-shelf laser that we modify to match our software, to work with our software. We've tested many of the off-the-shelf lasers, and the one we settled on was the one that was most appropriate. However, I will say that none of the off-the-shelf lasers is perfect for doing this job. One of the projects we have to undergo once we have our funding is to create our own laser that's specifically designed. And that sounds like a daunting task, but it's very easy. Diodes are very easy to get. There's a ready market for them out there. There's several manufacturers. And putting together a laser is really just a function of deciding which wavelengths you want, how many wavelengths you want, etc. What kind of cooling system you want, what kind of cabinetry do you want, etc. Then it's mostly in the software and formula. And how does it talk to your software or the cloud? And then what are the parameters that it is able to control, or the software is able to control in the laser? That's the limitation of the off-the-shelf lasers. They were all designed for something else. Most of the lasers out there, the Class 4 lasers, are used in veterinary offices for post-surgical care of animals after surgery to reduce swelling, pain, etc., reduce scar tissue. They're very effective for that. So we use one of those lasers. It's off the shelf. It works because we've been able to do what we need to do with the software, with our software over the cloud, to modify its parameters. But there's still limitations. And once we have our own laser, we'll remove those limitations and we'll be able to do more with it with the modality to make it even more effective. It's extraordinarily effective today using what we're doing. But I will tell you that just using an off-the-shelf laser is not enough. I get calls and comments all the time. People send me information that in their neighborhood, in their town, they've got a chiropractor who's got a Class 4 laser, in fact, the same brand that we use, and he's advertising that he can fix peripheral neuropathy, etc. The problem with that is he's got no way to titrate. Now, let me start off with the basic statement that phototherapy is biphasic. If you apply too little, you get no result. If you apply too much, you get no result. If you're dealing with a drug dosage, it's one variable, but in phototherapy, it's many variables. Now, the key is that these lasers work very well for soft tissue damage like tendinitis or general swelling, a swollen ankle, or a localized pain caused by some sprain or what have you. It works extraordinarily well for that. The reason it works well is because the therapeutic window, or the Goldilocks zone, if you will, too little too much, Goldilocks zone, that's very broad in those type of injuries, for those type of conditions. And it's very easy, the parameters of the laser don't have to be very precise to get a good effect. And we see that all the time. Those lasers work very well for those general purpose conditions. And the manufacturer builds in a canned program, one-size-fits-all treatment program for those things. So if you look on one of those lasers menu, it's got a menu for lower back pain. It's got a menu for acute pain in your knee, etc., etc. These are easy to treat, frankly. When you get to nerves, however, the therapeutic window is extraordinarily narrow. It takes a lot of precision on every one of those variables to get it right and to have an effect. That's not to say that one of those chiros with a laser can't get an effect. If you treat 10 patients, one of them, maybe two of them, are going to feel relief. The problem is that over time, that literally each treatment of a cycle, that patient's therapeutic window moves and changes because they're getting better through the treatment. So the first, even though the first, a couple, one or two patients out of that 10 in treats is going to feel relief in initial, eventually they won't. So maybe 3 or 4 treatments in, maybe 5 treatments in, they're going to stop getting any benefit because they've moved out of the therapeutic window that canned program is designed for, And from that point on, they're not going to get much relief at all. So the problem is, in order to do neuropathy, you have to have a way of titrating each and every time the patient comes in. One size fits all. The same parameters each time don't work. Over time, they just work. You have to be able to move with the therapeutic window. To do that, you have to have big data, what's called big data, masses of data. We happen to have and have developed over 8 years with 7 centers collected masses of data. We have the largest patient registry in the world, and it's the most dense patient registry in the world on peripheral neuropathy. It is the only registry on peripheral neuropathy designed to titrate phototherapy, all the variables that go into that, and all the things. Literally, we collect 6,000 data points on every patient going through the initial course of care. And that data allows us to use algorithms to determine what variables for this patient this day, what variables are important, which ones mean something, and what is the value of those today that works best. And that changes literally every time the patient comes in. That's something that chiropractor down the street with a hand program and his laser cannot do. Can't even come close to doing that. So there's a world of difference between the off-the-shelf lasers with a single program, a one-size-fits-all approach, to a titrated method of following that therapeutic window. And it makes a huge difference in the outcome. If that's fair enough.
Well, that's all the questions for now. I'd like to just conclude and thank Phil for a great presentation and good answers. But what we'd like to maybe just kind of wrap up with is our particular viewpoint as an investment bank, why we think this is an excellent investment. And one of the points that Phil answered during the presentation or during the question and answer, we saw this today as a great opportunity because it's a $300 billion market. In other words, 300 billion people, $300 billion is spent in the U.S. every year to try to relieve the symptoms of peripheral neuropathy. What is not brought to light here is basically they've already treated 2,000 patients, okay, that essentially have far more effective relief than a lot of the drugs that people are spending billions of dollars on, number one. Number two is the fact is that the company is operational. And this was really important for us in terms of our analysis, is that although we have a point out there that essentially that Medicare will approve it, but the company is operational, has revenue today. And so as it marches forward, as more people become aware of this particular effective treatment and a non-pharmaceutical without side effect type of relief, we think it's only going to grow over time and become far more valuable than even today because there's a lot of people who just don't know about it. Okay, and that's a really kind of a good position in this type of a market. The last thing we want to leave you with in terms of why this is a great investment is Biola's use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. That is, in that database, the combination of those two technologies with that database, okay, is unique in the industry today, worldwide. And so again, like Phil said, nobody has the data and nobody has the approach. So when Phil talked about the laser is a means to an end. The solution lies within the technology of that software. And this is where we think as this grows, that the value of this company is going to essentially hockey stick within several years. So the value that you invest in today, we think is going to bring extraordinary returns within a 3 to 5 year period. And so any questions, we'll be in touch with everybody here. They'll get a copy of the presentation. Again, Phil's open to any questions. We'll give you a way to get in contact with him, but we'll be reaching out to each and every one of you in the next couple days. So thank you for your attendance, and again, we'll be in touch with each and every one of you. Thank you again. Thanks again, Phil.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.